Grayson felt slightly dizzy when his feet touched the surface of the planet Artemis IV, where the famous intergalactic university was located. Since childhood, he had dreamed of this place, but the reality turned out to be even more impressive than his fantasies. Majestic buildings that seemed to have been created not by hands, but by space itself, rose to the clouds, surrounded by shimmering energy fields that seemed alive. Everything breathed knowledge and secrets that had to be discovered. Students of all shapes, sizes, and races scurried around. Each of them was the epitome of a unique civilization and history, and Grayson felt for a moment like the smallest part of this vast and fascinating world. Details caught his attention. Plants that changed color when touched, gravity platforms that carried students between building levels, glowing obelisks with inscriptions in ancient languages that Grayson could barely make out. All this was so new and incredible that he could not fully comprehend. He, a simple guy from Earth, found himself here among the representatives of the most advanced civilizations of the universe. This place was a center of science, art, and intergalactic cooperation, and Grayson couldn't wait to begin his studies. The campus was gigantic, and although Grayson had read about its size, he hadn't expected it to be so difficult to navigate. He made his way through the winding corridors, trying to find the hall where his first lecture was to begin. The university was organized into sectors, each of which specialized in a specific field of knowledge. Biology, astrophysics, the history of ancient civilizations, and even the study of the psychology of interracial contact. Grayson was in the Department of Galactic History, where he had to study ancient civilizations and ways of interaction between races. But from the very first steps on campus, he realized that he would have to learn much more than was described in his curriculum. Finally, he found the right building, a majestic white metal structure that seemed to float above the ground. At the entrance, he was greeted by a stream of students, each of whom seemed to be the embodiment of some distant galaxy. Some had 3 eyes, others had shimmering skin, and some moved on a gravity cushion without touching the ground. This current drew Grayson inside the building, and he, lost in the crowd, tried not to lose his bearings, holding a map of the campus in his hands. It was all too overwhelming, and at that moment, he felt like he was in the middle of something incredible. As he made his way through the crowd, Grayson suddenly felt a light blow on his shoulder, which brought him out of his state of admiration. He turned around and saw a girl in front of him, or as he quickly realized, not quite a girl. Her skin glowed with a soft golden light, and her long hair seemed to shimmer with a light blue glow, which made her appearance almost ephemeral. She was tall, with a surprisingly slender figure that reminded of ancient statues from the myths of Earth, but at the same time her face was both ethereal and familiar. Their eyes met for a moment. Her gaze was violet deep, as if hiding an entire galaxy. There was something ancient in those eyes that immediately fascinated Grayson. It seemed to him that in that look, he saw echoes of entire worlds, star systems, and ancient knowledge that stretched far beyond his comprehension. The moment lasted longer than it should have, as if time had slowed down for a second.
I'm sorry.
Grayson muttered uncertainly, realizing that he had inadvertently touched her. However, his words were almost inaudible. The voices around him boomed like 1,000 different languages, each of which was unfamiliar to him. The girl did not answer, but bent down to pick up one of the books that had fallen out of her hands during the collision. Grayson felt guilty and immediately sat down to help her. He grabbed one of the books and, looking at the cover, realized that they were textbooks on cosmobiology, a discipline he knew only by hearsay. The book was written in a language Grayson couldn't read, but the graphs and diagrams on its pages suggested that it was something extremely complex and layered. He handed her the book, noticing how his hand was shaking slightly. For some reason, this girl, if you could call her that, gave him a strange feeling. It was not fear, but something like a slight trembling excitement. She accepted the book with a quiet nod, her slender fingers lightly touching him, and Grayson felt that slight electric pulse running through his skin again. Her touch was soft, but there was a power in it that he couldn't explain. It was as if she hadn't just picked up the book, but had exchanged something important with him, even if it was just a silent interaction. For a moment, they just stood and looked at each other. Grayson could feel something inside him starting to move. It was not just a meeting, not just a clash between 2 students in a bustling corridor of the university. He understood that he was facing someone who was not just a different species, but also someone who was able to completely change his perception of the world. It was a strange feeling, but at the same time exciting. They were both silent. She didn't say a word, but her eyes, like deep space, spoke for themselves. Grayson felt that at that moment, despite the lack of verbal communication, they understood each other on some intuitive level. Her gaze was not hostile or distant. On the contrary, there was a certain depth and even a slight curiosity in him. He could see that she was also a little puzzled by this encounter. After they exchanged books, Grayson took a step back, feeling that he needed to give her space. But his thoughts were still wandering around this girl, her appearance, her mysterious silence, her purple eyes. He couldn't find an explanation, but something drew him to her, as if their meeting was destined by the stars. She nodded at him, as if acknowledging their brief interaction, and then, with the same graceful movement that seemed almost unreal, disappeared into the crowd of students, engulfing her as quickly as she appeared. Grayson stood motionless for several seconds, his mind engulfed by thoughts of what had happened. His heart was still beating fast. He couldn't understand why he was so impressed by this meeting. Maybe it was her unusual beauty, maybe it was her silent mystery. But one thing was clear, he couldn't get her out of his mind anymore. Even when he finally headed to the auditorium for his lecture, thoughts of her continued to bother him. He tried to focus on the professor's words, but the image of her purple eyes kept popping up in front of his eyes. The lecture was over, but Grayson was still preoccupied with the girl. He didn't know her name, didn't know where she was from or what she was studying, but something inside him said that this meeting was not accidental. He felt that this was just the beginning of something bigger, something that he could not yet comprehend. After the unexpected meeting with Lyra, Grayson couldn't get her out of his mind for a long time. Her image remained with him like an unfinished thought, like a flash of light against the background of everyday life, haunting. It seemed that this meeting turned his inner world upside down, making everything around him at the same time more vivid and mysterious. The whole first day at the university he listened to lectures, strolled around campus, met new people, but his thoughts returned to that mysterious alien with purple eyes in which Grayson saw entire star systems. A few days passed, and Grayson saw her again. It happened in the library, a place where knowledge from all over the galaxy is collected, reflecting the culture, science, and philosophy of thousands of civilizations. The university library was huge, its halls stretched for kilometers, and the corridors looked like labyrinths. There was a silence that seemed almost sacred, and everyone who came here immediately fell into the atmosphere of knowledge, immersed in books and holographic projections. Grayson loved spending time in the library. For him, it was a place where he could focus on studying ancient civilizations and the history of galactic peoples. That day, he was looking for books on cosmopolitanism. He was interested in how different planets created interstellar alliances. He was looking through the rows of books when he suddenly felt her presence again. Lyra was sitting at one of the tables, her long hair glowing with a light blue glow, and she was completely immersed in reading. Grayson stopped for a moment, watching her. Her figure was graceful, but there was something both calm and focused in her posture, as if she was part of this universe of knowledge. He didn't want to bother her, but at the same time, he couldn't just walk by. Curiosity was growing inside him. Who is she? What is she interested in? What worlds had she seen? What stars were familiar to her? She seemed to him the embodiment of everything he wanted to understand about the universe, inaccessible and alluring at the same time. Grayson walked past her, trying not to attract attention, but Lyra, as if sensing his presence, raised her head. Their eyes met again, and Grayson felt the same elusive connection as the first time. It was a strange feeling, as if they already knew each other. Lyra nodded at him in recognition, and Grayson, although caught off guard, smiled slightly in response. He didn't know what to say and decided to just move on, although the desire to talk and the fear of seeming intrusive were fighting inside him. The next day, Grayson saw Lyra again, this time at one of the lectures. It was a lecture on the ancient history of galactic empires, a topic he studied with great interest. The lecture talked about ancient civilizations that existed millions of years ago, how they developed technology, explored space, and established interstellar contact. Grayson sat at the back of the room and listened intently, taking notes. But his attention occasionally shifted to Lyra, sitting a few rows ahead. She was engrossed in the lecture, her gaze focused on the lecturer. And Grayson again felt that feeling that she belonged to the ancient wisdom that he so wanted to comprehend. Lyra didn't just listen. She seemed to absorb every word, analyzing and processing information at a level that was inaccessible to an ordinary person. Grayson was fascinated by her calmness and concentration. After the lecture, when the students began to disperse, Grayson suddenly noticed that Lyra remained in place, looking through her notes. He stopped at the exit, feeling that this was a chance to talk to her, but his inner insecurity still did not allow him to take the first step. He understood that they were from different worlds and that her interests and thoughts might be too far from his own, but something inside him said that it was this difference that attracted him. Finally, he gathered his strength and took a step towards her. She looked up as he came closer, and a slight curiosity flashed across her face.
You say, interesting lecture, isn't it?
Grayson muttered, feeling his voice sound uncertain. Lyrael looked at him with mild curiosity, but her face remained calm. She didn't answer right away, as if she was considering his words. Her silence was not awkward. It was filled with some deep meaning, as if she was analyzing his words not from the point of view of content, but their deep implication.
Yes?
She said shortly. Her voice was soft, but there was a hidden power in it.
Me. Very much.
This short answer opened the door to something more. They started talking about the lecture, about ancient civilizations, about how these empires interacted with other races, and how it influenced the history of the galaxy. Grayson was surprised to find that Lyra knew more about many of these civilizations than most of the students. Her knowledge was deep, and she talked about events that were only a theory to him, as if they were something very personal. It was as if she herself was a part of those times, or at least her culture had deep roots in those ancient empires. They talked for a long time, and Grayson realized that her interest in ancient history was not just academic. It was something more, almost spiritual. She perceived history as a living entity, as a network of connections that continued to influence modernity. For her, history was not just a chain of events. It was part of a cosmic cycle that united all races, all civilizations, and even the stars. From that day on, they began to spend more and more time together. Their friendship grew amid discussions of philosophy, science, and history. Grayson was fascinated by her vision of the world, her ability to see deep connections in ordinary things. Lyrael, in turn, seemed interested in his human view of the universe. For her, a representative of a civilization that had existed for thousands of years, the human worldview was something new and unexpected. She didn't talk about it directly, but Grayson sensed that she was genuinely passionate about their conversations. One day they went on an excursion to one of the university's research centers, where they studied ancient artifacts collected from different planets. This center housed objects that belonged to long-vanished civilizations. Grayson and Lyrael stood for a long time in front of one of the artifacts, a stone obelisk with symbols carved on it. Lyrael, as always, was immersed in studying, her fingers sliding over the ancient runes, and Grayson felt her curiosity being transferred to him. He watched her with admiration. Her every gesture, every look was full of meaning. She was like a conduit between worlds, and Grayson was becoming more and more convinced that this friendship had become more than just an exchange of knowledge for him. He felt connected to her on a level that went beyond ordinary human communication. She opened up worlds for him that he could not comprehend alone, and he began to realize that this was not just learning or research. It was something deeper. Grayson often reflected on how their relationship was developing. At first, it was just an academic collaboration, but he soon realized that there was something more between them. He was attracted to Lyrael. Her mystery and depth were like a magnet that haunted, but something inside him stopped him from admitting his feelings. He understood that they were from different worlds, and it scared him. Will they be able to build something more than just friendship? They continued to meet in the library, at lectures, in laboratories. Every day was filled with new discoveries, and Grayson felt that with each new meeting they were getting closer. Grayson couldn't tell exactly when his friendship with Lyrael began to turn into something more. They spent a lot of time together, and every moment spent with her seemed to him filled with a hidden meaning that he had not noticed before. So perhaps it happened gradually, like a slow awakening, when he began to realize that she was taking up more and more space in his thoughts, and that her presence had become for him something much more than just studying together or discussing lectures. The initial curiosity that connected them became the basis for deeper feelings that began to arise in his heart. Her calm confidence, her mysterious smile, the way she could listen to him as if every word mattered, it all gradually grew into something more. So Grayson felt attracted to Lyrael on a level he couldn't rationalize or explain to himself scientifically. All this was new to him. He was used to analyzing his every decision, but this time feelings began to control his thoughts, filling his inner world with new, unexpected colors. Each of their meetings in the library, at lectures, or in scientific laboratories now seemed to him to be something much more significant than just communication between two students. Grayson began to notice subtle changes in the way he looked at Lyrael, how he reacted to her presence. His gaze lingered on her longer than before, and his heart began to beat faster every time their eyes met. He began to feel a special excitement when they worked side by side as if even the silence between them had acquired a new, deeper meaning. Again, he knew he was attracted to her, but he wasn't sure if she felt the same way. Her alien nature, which at first aroused in him only admiration and scientific curiosity, now became part of his growing feelings. Lyrael was different in every sense. Her appearance, her movements, even her perception of time and space were different from human, but that's what attracted him. He had never felt such a strong attraction to someone who was so different from himself before. This attraction was not just physical, it was an attraction to her essence, to her thinking and perception of the world. One day they found themselves back in the library, immersed in the study of ancient texts on cosmology. It was one of those quiet evenings when the campus was empty and there was an almost sacred silence around. Lyra was sitting opposite, her hands folded on an ancient book, and her luminous blue hair fell softly over her shoulders, adding to her image of mystery and unreality. Grayson sat across from her, watching her as she immersed herself in the text, her face focused, but at the same time calm. At that moment, he felt a feeling growing in him that had been bothering him for a long time. In the silence of the library, among the rows of antique books and holographic projections of star systems, Grayson suddenly realized that he could no longer ignore his feelings. It was like an epiphany, an instant realization that Lyra had become more than just a friend or a study colleague for him. She became a part of his life, a part of his thoughts, his heart. He could no longer deny that he was attracted to her, not only as a being with incredible intelligence and deep knowledge, but also as a woman who touched his soul. But with this realization came doubts. Grayson understood that they were from different worlds and that their differences could become a barrier. Her alien nature, her race, her perception of life and time, all this made their connection difficult and possibly impossible. He didn't know what Lyrael was thinking, how she perceived him and their relationship. It seemed to him that she also felt something special, but her calmness and equanimity did not give him confidence. Sometimes her behavior was so mysterious that Grayson couldn't figure out what she was really thinking and feeling. He recalled how they explored ancient artifacts together, how their hands accidentally touched, and this simple touch caused him unusual sensations, as if energy slipped between them that did not require words. He saw her smile when they found something interesting in their research, and felt how her presence had a calming and at the same time exciting effect on him. Every conversation they had, every touch, every look had intensified his feelings, and now it was becoming something for him that could no longer be ignored. However, every time he wanted to take a step forward, something stopped him. Fear of the unknown, the fear that Lyra might not share his feelings, or perhaps it was the uncertainty of whether they would be able to overcome the cultural and biological barriers that stood between them. Grayson knew that Lyrael was from a different race, and her perception of emotions could be very different from a human's. He was afraid that she might perceive their relationship as something ordinary, not giving them the importance that he attached. As time passed, Grayson felt that his inner conflict was only getting worse. He wanted to confess his feelings to her, but he didn't know how to do it. He was afraid that his confession might change their friendship and perhaps even destroy it. And yet every new day spent with Lyra made his feelings stronger. It seemed to him that there was an indissoluble bond between them, which lasted despite all their differences. One evening, they went on one of the student excursions off campus. It was a study of an ancient observatory on the distant moon of Artemis IV. The satellite was uninhabited, but on its surface, there were ruins of an ancient civilization that left behind complex structures for space exploration. Grayson and Lyra found themselves alone at the top of one of the ancient towers, which offered a stunning view of the starry sky. The sky was so clear that it seemed as if you could reach the stars. They stood side by side, watching the stars, and Grayson felt that feeling again, which overwhelmed him. Lyrael was so close that he could feel her presence with every cell of his body. At that moment, he realized that he could no longer remain silent. His feelings had become too strong for him to hide them. He turned to her, his heart beating faster, and he felt the tension building in his chest. Lyrael, sensing his movement, also turned to him. Her eyes, as always, were full of depth and calmness, and at that moment, Grayson sensed that she, too, was feeling something special. They were silent, but their look said more than any words. It was a moment that lasted forever, and Grayson knew it was a crucial moment. He slowly reached out his hand, and his fingers touched hers. It was a light, almost weightless touch, but it had the strongest effect. Lyrael did not pull away. Her eyes remained focused on him, and Grayson felt an invisible spark pass between them. This touch was their confession. It was soft, but at the same time full of hidden power. Grayson felt that Lirael accepted his feelings, and this realization brought him incredible relief. They continued to stand on top of the ancient tower, holding each other's hands, and at that moment Grayson realized that their connection was real. It wasn't just his imagination or a temporary infatuation. It was a love real and deep that transcended the boundaries of their worlds, their races, and cultural difference. After Grayson and Lirael realized their mutual affection, their relationship became much closer. They began to spend even more time together, exploring not only the world around them and ancient knowledge, but also each other. There was something more growing in their silent gestures and rare touches that was difficult to put into words. However, as their bond deepened, the obstacles that could destroy their love began to appear. In their relationship, as in any other, issues began to arise that required not just an emotional response, but serious reflection. The first and perhaps most obvious obstacle was their differences, not only physical and cultural, but also psychological. Although Lirael was so close to him in spirit, her alien nature was still a mystery. Her world, her race, and even her perception of reality were different from the ones Grayson was used to. The closer they got, the more he felt that these differences could become insurmountable. For Grayson, as a human being, love has always been associated with emotional and physical intimacy. He grew up in a world where feelings are expressed through touch, hugs, words, but Lirael was different. Her love was expressed differently through silence, through deep looks, through her presence. Grayson understood that she loved him, but it was difficult for him to get used to the way she showed this love. She could sit next to him for hours, just enjoying his presence without saying a word. It was natural for her, but Grayson, as a representative of another civilization accustomed to dynamic and vivid emotions, felt some discomfort. He was beginning to doubt whether they would be able to build a real relationship. Will he be able to get used to her form of expression of feelings? And will Lirael be able to understand his needs? Sometimes Grayson felt isolated from her, as if they were in the same place but in different worlds. He understood that he could not demand changes from her, but his own needs and expectations, rooted in human nature, became a source of internal conflict. One day, during one of their quiet walks around campus, Grayson felt this disappointment especially keenly. Lirael walked beside her, her long, luminous hair flowing softly in the wind, and her face, as always, was calm and thoughtful. They were silent, as they often were between them, but this time the silence seemed heavy. Grayson couldn't help but think that their differences would eventually destroy everything they had built. He understood that their love was real, but would it be enough to overcome all obstacles? Another obstacle that soon became apparent was their biological differences. No matter how deep their emotional connection was, the physiological differences remained insurmountable. Lirael belonged to a race that existed beyond human concepts of life and death. Her metabolism, her biological processes, even her perception of time were different. Grayson began to wonder how they would live on if their bodies were so different. Would he ever be able to truly be with her in a physical sense? And what if her lifespan turned out to be significantly longer than his own? Grayson often wondered about this when they sat together in silence. He looked at Lirael and tried to imagine their future. What if he gets old and she stays the same young and beautiful? Would she be able to stay with him when his body began to weaken and fade? These thoughts scared him. He didn't know how she perceived time, how she saw their relationship in the long term. Lirael, as always, did not talk about these things, and Grayson began to feel that an invisible wall was appearing between them. She might have seen their future differently, but she didn't share her thoughts, and Grayson didn't dare ask directly. This silence between them became another source of doubt and uncertainty. Grayson didn't know how to deal with these thoughts, and it seemed to him that Lirael was just living in the present, not thinking about what would happen next. At some point, Grayson began to notice that Lirael often spends time alone, immersed in her thoughts. He tried to figure out what was going on in her head, but every time he came across her silence. She could sit for hours watching the stars or studying ancient texts, and Grayson couldn't shake the feeling that she was holding something inside her, something she didn't want to talk about. Perhaps she doubted their future too, but she didn't show it. Her culture, her biology, did not allow her to share her fears as a human would. In addition, Grayson began to think more and more about how society would perceive their relationship. He understood that if their relationship became known at the university or beyond, it would raise a lot of questions. People on Earth, as well as representatives of other civilizations, might not understand their love. The worlds they came from had their own rules and regulations, and Grayson began to doubt whether they would be able to overcome this social pressure. Questions about what others would say began to worry him more than he would like to admit. Will he be able to handle the condemnation? will Lyrael be able to withstand this pressure? These thoughts haunted him even in those moments when they were together. Every time he looked at Lyrael, he was overcome by conflicting feelings. He wanted to be with her, but at the same time, he was afraid that their love might face insurmountable obstacles. He understood that this fear was not just his own, but also reflected the gap between their civilizations. Lyrael was the epitome of everything he loved and admired, but at the same time, her alien nature made her unattainable in a sense. At some point, Grayson began to feel like he was at a crossroads. On the one hand, his feelings for Lyrael were getting stronger, but on the other hand, all these doubts and fears continued to grow. He was afraid that if they couldn't overcome these obstacles, their bond would be destroyed. He had to make a decision whether to continue fighting for their love or accept that they were too different to be together. But the choice was not easy. In every quiet meeting with Lyrael, in every look they exchanged, Grayson sensed the depth of their bond. They became a part of each other's lives. Their bonds were too strong to just break. He felt that despite all these doubts, despite all the differences, their love was real. But will she be able to stand the test of time and circumstances? One evening, as they sat together on the riverbank, Grayson felt this inner conflict again. Lyrael was there, her figure illuminated by the soft light of the stars, and everything seemed peaceful and calm. But this time, the silence between them did not bring him peace. It seemed to him that he was drowning in his thoughts, unable to find a way out. He looked at her and realized that he couldn't hide his doubts anymore, but he didn't know how to put them into words. Lyrael, as always, was silent. Her face remained impassive, but Grayson sensed that she was hiding something too. Perhaps she was aware of his fears. Perhaps she herself felt insecure about their future. He could not understand her completely, and this misunderstanding became more and more painful for him. Finally, he stood up and took a few steps towards the water. He stood on the edge of the shore, looking at the quiet waves, and felt his soul tearing inside him. Would he ever truly understand her? And would she be able to understand him? These questions tormented him, but there was no answer. He understood that their bond was too important to just back off. But at the same time, he was afraid that if they didn't find a way to deal with these differences, their love would be doomed. After many quiet evenings when Grayson and Lyrael wandered along the banks of the rivers of Artemis IV, the silence between them became more intense, but also disturbing. Their relationship, which began with mutual curiosity and friendship, was now entangled in complex feelings and doubts. Grayson's inner conflict, his fear of the differences between them in the future, grew every day. The time we spent together was both wonderful and painful. He felt that he could no longer hide his feelings, but as soon as he tried to find words, they immediately disappeared. Their world of stares and silence seemed unstable. Lyrael continued to remain a mystery. She was by his side, always calm, always lost in her own thoughts. Her eyes were still looking at him with the same depth that he had been drowning in since the first moment they met. Grayson understood that her alien nature, her culture and biology made her perception of the world and love different, unlike a human one. She was a being from another universe, and that raised endless questions for him. Did she understand his feelings? Did she separate them? And if so, why didn't she ever talk about it? This silence, which at first seemed to be filled with meaning, now weighed on him. But one day, their quiet, almost silent existence was interrupted. It was one of those evenings when Grayson and Lyrael were in a remote part of the campus where the observatory for stargazing was located. Silence reigned around them, which was sometimes broken by the sounds of the wind passing between the tall towers. The starry sky was so close that it seemed like you could touch it by stretching out your hand. Grayson and Lyrael stood on the landing, looking up at the endless constellations, some of which belonged to worlds unknown to people. Lyrael stood motionless, her gaze fixed on the distant stars, but Grayson could sense that she was deep in thought. Her calmness, her silence, suddenly became unbearable for him. Tension had been building up inside him for a long time, and now he felt that he could no longer stand this waiting, this silent expectation of something that never happened. They were too close, and at the same time, this closeness became painful for him. He stood next to her, feeling the invisible barrier that separated them. This barrier was not physical, not cultural, but rather existed in his mind, his fears. He knew that now he had to say something. He had to explain his feelings, his doubts. It was a moment that couldn't be missed, but it also seemed incredibly difficult to take. Grayson took a slow breath, gathering his resolve, but still couldn't find the words. He didn't know where to start. Everything he felt seemed both too complicated and too simple. He loved her. There was no doubt about that. But he was afraid that his confession might change everything they have. perhaps even destroy their bond. But it was impossible to pull any further. At that moment, Lyra turned her head slightly, her deep purple eyes meeting his gaze. She looked at him with her usual calmness, but this time there was something else in her gaze, something that had not been so obvious before. Grayson felt everything inside him shrink. It was that very moment he knew he had to say that their silence could no longer be so intense and empty at the same time.
Lyrael,
He said in a barely audible voice, although the name sounded to him like an explosion in the silence. His voice sounded hoarse. It was filled with tension that he had been holding back for weeks. He looked at her, waiting for some kind of reaction, but her face remained as calm as ever. Grayson understood that her world, her race, perceived emotions differently, that for her love and feelings could be something that did not need words or manifestations. But for him, as a human being, it was too important. He took a step forward, feeling fear and excitement begin to build in his chest. He didn't know how to express everything that had accumulated inside. His every step, every word seemed too uncertain to him, but it was too late to retreat.
I can't take it anymore.
He finally said, his voice trembling.
I can't hide how I feel about you anymore.
Lyra continued to stare at him, and Grayson felt something new appear in her gaze. A certain softness that had not been there before. She didn't back down, didn't look away, but she didn't answer either. It was like a moment of truth in which everything depended on what he would say next. He took another step forward, and now there was only a short distance between them. Grayson felt his heart begin to beat faster. His mind was full of thoughts about how things could change. He wanted to understand her, wanted to know how she felt. But at the same time, he knew that her culture, her world might not allow her to express emotions the way people do.
Lyrael,
He said again, his voice firmer.
I do not know if you understand what I'm trying to say, but I love you. I do not know how you see it. I do not know what it means to you, but I can no longer hide it.
His confession hung in the air, and at that moment, the silence became almost tangible. Grayson stood in front of her, his heart pounding in his chest, and he waited for her answer. Several long seconds passed, and finally Lyra took a step forward. Her face remained calm, but there was a certain determination in her movements that amazed him. She slowly reached out her hand, and her fingers lightly touched his arm. It was a light touch, but Grayson felt an invisible energy rush between them, as if it were their real confession. She didn't say anything, but her eyes, her movements, said more than words could say. It was like a confession without words, like a response to his feelings. At that moment, Grayson realized that her love was different, but no less strong. Her silence, her calmness, was her way of loving. She didn't need words to express what she was feeling. Her touch was enough. She loved him, but her love was woven into her essence, into her world where emotions needed no expression. They were standing on the observatory site, and the stars above them were shining brighter than ever. Their hands were joined, and Grayson felt that there were no more barriers between them. All his doubts, all his fears began to disappear. He realized that their differences didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that they were together, that their feelings were real. At that moment, an invisible exchange of energy took place between them, which was not just a confirmation of love, but also a symbol that they were ready to overcome all obstacles. Grayson felt that their connection transcended time and space, that it existed on a level that could not be explained in words. It was a love that overcame the barriers of civilizations and worlds, a love that existed despite all differences. Lyra slowly released his hand, but her eyes continued to look at him with the same softness and depth. She didn't say anything, but Grayson didn't need any more words. He realized that they had taken a step forward, that now their bond was stronger than ever. After the confession that took place under the starry sky at the observatory site, everything changed. Grayson and Lyra felt that they had taken a step towards something bigger and deep. Their connection, which had seemed fragile and uncertain, was now filled with meaning, but at the same time with questions that could not be ignored. They finally admitted their feelings to each other, not in words, but through the subtle gestures and glances they exchanged. How to live or faced with an inevitable dilemma. How to live on. Grayson couldn't help but think that their love, although real, faced real obstacles. The day after they confessed to each other, he began to realize the complexity of the situation. Girl belonged to an alien race. Her perception of the world, time, life, and even love itself was completely different. What seemed natural and necessary to him, hugs, words of love, concern for the future, for her was something that did not require such an expression. Lyra didn't talk about the future. She lived in the here and now, as if the future was just another facet of the present. Grayson knew that her world, Her civilization did not perceive time linearly, as is customary among humans. It was one of those barriers that had been bothering him until now. He couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. They both studied at the intergalactic university, but their studies will end sooner or later, and what will happen then? What awaits them outside the walls of this place, where they could afford to get lost in their feelings? One of the most pressing questions for Grayson was whether they could be together in his world, on Earth. Lyra was not just a representative of another culture. Her biology, her nature were different from human ones. Despite her outward resemblance to humans, she was still different. Grayson began to wonder if they could live in a society that might not accept their connection. He had seen some students at the university already looking at them with curiosity or even condemnation. What if things get much more complicated on Earth? Would Lyra be able to adapt to life among humans if she decided to follow him? These questions tormented Grayson. He felt that their love was deep and real, but at the same time he had to face reality. Every time he looked at Lyra, his heart was filled with warmth, but this warmth was overshadowed by anxiety for the future. He knew that Lyra perceived their relationship differently. She wasn't worried about what would happen in a year or 10 years. She lived here and now, and her calmness sometimes scared Grayson. How could she accept everything so calmly without thinking about what might be waiting for them outside this world? Several days they continued to meet as before. They spent time in the library, at lectures, studying ancient texts, and exploring new worlds. But Grayson sensed that there was something invisible hanging over them that needed to be resolved. Every time he started thinking about the future, he was seized with doubts. Lyra, on the other hand, continued to remain as quiet and unperturbed. She didn't talk about her plans, and that made Grayson feel insecure. He didn't know what she was thinking about what would happen next. Maybe she just didn't think about it, or maybe she thought it didn't matter. One day, when they were back at the top of one of the university towers, looking at distant planets and stars, Grayson realized that he could no longer remain silent. They stood side by side, and the cold wind dragged the smells of other worlds with it. Lyra, as always, was lost in her thoughts, her eyes carefully following the starry sky, as if she was looking for answers to some of her questions. Grayson stared at her, feeling his heart constrict with all these unresolved questions. He knew that he could not continue to live in this ignorance. The future that worried him so much seemed to Lyra to be something distant and abstract. But for him, as a human being, it mattered. He wanted to know what would happen next, how they could be together, and if they could at all. Slowly took a step forward, his thoughts full of uncertainty and anxiety. He felt that inner conflict again, between his feelings for Lyra and the reality of their differences. He knew this was the moment of truth.
Lyra,
He began softly, his voice trembling with tension.
I have to understand. What's going to happen next?
Lyra did not immediately turn to him. Her gaze was still fixed on the sky, but Grayson knew she had heard him. Her silence was again a painful reminder to him of how different they were. He needed an explanation. He needed to know that she was also thinking about the future, that she was also worried about their life together. But her silence dragged on for too long, and the silence became unbearable. Finally, Lyra turned her head to him, her eyes calm as always, but this time Grayson caught something different in them. Perhaps she also understood that it was time for an answer. She took a step towards him, her movements soft and smooth, as if the wind was guiding her. She looked at him, her face unreadable, but in her gaze he felt a depth that he could not read to the end. Lyra didn't say anything, but Grayson realized that her answer lay in that look. For her, the future did not have the importance that he attached to it. She lived in harmony with the world, with nature, with the cosmos. And for her, every moment was an eternity. She saw no point in planning or worrying about what might happen in a year or a decade. For her, their connection was already something endless beyond time, and Grayson felt his heart stop. He understood that this was not what he wanted to hear. He needed more confidence, more specifics. But Lyra just couldn't give it to him. Her world was different, and she couldn't change her perception for him. That didn't mean she didn't love him. She loved, but her love didn't need the reassurances and guarantees that Grayson needed. They continued to stand at the top of the tower. The wind continued to blow, taking their thoughts with it. Grayson realized that he was faced with a choice. He could accept her for who she was, with her whole world and her perception of time. Or he could back off, admitting that their differences were too great for them to be together. But how could this choice be made? How could you give up a love that was so strong, so real? Grayson looked at Lyra and realized that he couldn't let her go. Despite all the differences, despite all the fears, he knew that he loved her and that this feeling would always be with him, no matter how their destinies turned out. Lyra, as if reading his mind, took a step forward and touched his arm. Her touch was light, but it had the same energy that Grayson had felt from the beginning. That touch told him more than any words. She was ready to go with him wherever the stars led them. Her love was unlimited and free, and Grayson realized that this was her answer. She couldn't make promises to him because her world didn't know such concepts. But she was here with him at that moment, and that was enough. They stood together, their hands joined, and the stars sparkled above them as always. Grayson realized that their future remained uncertain, but he was willing to accept it. Lyral didn't need promises or plans. She lived in the present, and her love was a part of that present. Grayson also decided to live in this moment without fear of the future. Maybe they will stay together for the rest of their lives, or maybe their paths will separate. But Grayson knew one thing: their love was real, and that was enough to take a step forward into the unknown.